call to order the study session for the City Council for the City of Wheat Ridge, Colorado for August 3rd, 2020. Thank you for joining us. We have two items on our study session tonight. We have on item number 1, Zoning 101, talking about how we get to zoning, what our zoning issues look like in our regulations, and new prep on that. And number 2 is the review of public notification procedures and policies for land use cases, which has been brought up by Mr. Stites and Ms. Hoppy. So those are our two items on the agenda. We always start our study session meetings with public comment on items that are on the agenda only. So there was some previous discussion about a discussion of items that were not on the agenda. So if you would just like to speak on any items on the agenda, now is your opportunity to do so. You may raise your hand in the Zoom format. On the telephone, you may ask to speak, and I will recognize you. And I will ask Ms. Sheck, who's in council chambers, I believe, or at City Hall. Is there anyone at council chambers tonight wishing to speak on any agenda item?
No one in chambers tonight, Mayor.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have anyone with their hand up in the Zoom format?
No, we don't.
Okay, is there anyone joining us on the telephone from the public who would like to speak tonight on an agenda item? I don't hear anyone, so we will close our public comment section and go to agenda item number 1. And then Mr. Goff, do we have a staff presentation on this item?
We do. Our instructor this evening is going to be Lauren Mikulak, manager, and Ken Johnstone's here, also our community development director. But I think
okay. I don't know if I should address you as Dr. Mikulak, but Instructor Mikulak, please proceed.
Thank you. Let me share my screen and get everything organized here.
Oh, and for the record, I will say that we have all of our city council members present tonight for tonight's study session. We thank you all for being here and hope that Ms. Hulteen had a nice vacation. Very good.
Can you see the blue slide that says Zoning 101?
Yes,
okay.
We can. Zoning 101.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having us, indulging us here tonight. So I think you know me, Lauren Mikulak. I manage the planning division in the community development department. And I'm happy to be here to talk about zoning. We call ourselves planners, but as you could tell from our memo, we're really just zoning geeks. We didn't expect it to be quite that long, but we couldn't help ourselves. So I am going to go through a presentation tonight. I won't cover everything in the memo, but I do want to reinforce some of the more important points. My presentation is maybe 15, 20 minutes long, and then Ken and I would welcome your questions on any of the topics. I'm going to cover some of the background information that we provided and then spend most of my time speaking on the 3 types of zone districts that we talk about the most frequently when you're reviewing zone change applications. So the base or straight zoning, planned developments, and mixed use. So we'll jump right in. Zoning is essentially the link between our guiding documents, so the pie in the sky documents, and the real world built environment that we see around us. So our vision and policy documents like our comp plan and the NRS and our sub-area plans are all asking the question essentially of what we want the city to look and feel like. And zoning translates that vision into a set of rules and regulations. And then as development occurs over time, it's those zoning rules that result in the built environment we want to see. So the homes and businesses and neighborhoods and corridors that make our community unique. Zoning essentially asks 2 basic questions. It's a set of rules that dictates the use and development of private property, and it answers what can I do with my property and what can it look like. So for example, can I have a detached garage at my home? Yes or no? What can it look like? Can it be in this location here between the house and the street? How tall can it be? How far from the property line? Or in a commercial context, our mayor may have asked, can I have a restaurant on this property? Yes or no? How much parking does it need? How big can the sign be? How much landscaping is required? So zoning is going to regulate the size and shape of buildings. It regulates the design of a building and the design of the site horizontally. So parking, landscape, lighting, signage, setback, screening, height, and more. I think that the answers to those 2 questions depends on the zone district. And Wheat Ridge was incorporated in 1969, and we inherited much of our zoning from Jefferson County. So this is actually an image of our original zoning map. It's from 1972. We do actually have to refer to it every so often. And you can see on the left-hand side, maybe there's a legend. So we didn't have as many zone districts then as we do now, because as is typical, our zoning map evolves and our zoning regulations evolve as our community's vision evolves. So today, this is our zoning map, I think printed in November. We have 26 different zone districts, and each district, represented here by a different color, essentially has its own rule book and its own distinct answers to those questions of what you can do and what it can look like. Historically, zoning was used to separate seemingly incompatible uses. So zoning essentially came around in the early 1900s when folks in America in particular were trying to separate industrial uses and slaughterhouses from residential uses. It was really actually born in a public health movement to get neighborhoods away from heavier industrial and commercial uses. And we still see that legacy today. So when you look at your map and just sort of squint, you can see that the yellowish greenish colors are our neighborhoods. And then the wider range of colors are the commercial corridors and employment areas. All of these colors can essentially be categorized into a few different types of zone districts. So in the memo, we describe the base or straight zoning, land developments, mixed use, and overlays. And I really want to spend a few moments talking about those first three, because those are the zone districts that you see most often in the city and our zoning map, and also you as a body that you see as the subject of zone change applications. So if nothing else after tonight, we hope that you feel like you understand more what these three types of districts are and why we would recommend one over the other in different contexts. So we'll start with base zoning. Our base zone districts are essentially our most traditional type of zoning, and they're really prescriptive in terms of separating residential and commercial uses. And in that way, they're really pretty inflexible. It's the most common form of zoning across the country, and it dates back to those early 1900 zoning codes. And for the most part, we inherited these zone districts from the county when we incorporated. You don't see a lot of zone change requests to these districts because of a couple of code provisions that we've actually had on the books for some time now. So the first of those is that for any residential property over 1 acre in size, the code prohibits a rezoning to one of these base districts. So if a residential property is over 1 acre, it actually has to go to a planned development. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then secondly, the code actually prohibits a rezone to 4 out of these 5 commercial zone districts as well. And that's based on our city's historic reliance on planned development zoning. It wasn't until 2012 that we started allowing properties to rezone to this industrial employment district. And that was specifically at the recommendation of one of our vision documents, the city's comprehensive plan. So in preparing our memo, we did a little analysis of some of the zone change requests just to give you a sense of how few you really see of these. In the last 10 years, there were only 6 requests to a base zone district. And in the last 20 years, out of 99 zone changes, only 14 went to a base zone district. So it's just not a great option, in part because of the sort of reason for folks asking for a zone change, and in part because of those 2 code provisions. What we provided in the memo were a couple of examples, because I think some of this just makes more sense when we base it in the real world and real world examples. So our most recent zone change actually that you saw last Monday was a zone district to base zoning. So a zone change from agricultural 1A1 to residential 2. That was for an existing duplex on 46th Avenue. And this really represents the most common type of base zoning request, where you have a smaller lot trying to correct a mismatch between the zoning, the use, and the surroundings. So these kinds of mismatches are actually fairly common in the city, since so much of it was built before the city existed, when we were unincorporated Jeffco. The second type of zoning I want to talk about are planned developments. And we have 5 different types: residential, commercial, industrial, mixed use, and hospital. That's what that middle initial stands for. And in Wheat Ridge, like I said, we have a really long tradition of relying on planned developments, which are essentially a customized set of zoning regulations for one specific property. Planned residential and commercial developments did actually appear on our very first zoning map, and they became increasingly popular in the 70s and 80s. I think in the memo we talk about some of the state legislation that resulted in that increasing popularity. And the reason for using a plan development is often because a property has a unique or a challenging characteristic. So base zoning is written with the assumption that sort of all land is flat and rectangular and has a long enough street frontage. But in reality, and especially in our context, we have a lot of properties that may be irregular in shape or have steep slopes. In Wheat Ridge, as you know, we have predominantly infill development, meaning new development has to squeeze in and relate well to other existing uses and conditions. And because the regulations can be customized to a specific property and a specific proposal, a plan development actually works really well for infill situations. You have seen at public hearings the documents that accompany a plan development request. And one of the benefits of a plan development is actually the transparency of the process. So plan developments are sometimes called negotiated zoning because an applicant has to prepare all of these drawings and present them and provide very clear answers to those two questions. What are you going to do with your land and what is it going to look like? So they prepare and share, our applicants at hearings, exactly what they're going to do with the land. These drawings show the site design, the architecture, the landscaping. We call them outline and specific development plans. And for the other types of zone change requests, this kind of detail is never provided. It's not required to be provided. Another recent example of a plan development would be the property on 38th Avenue. As you know, that property's been vacant for a really long time, and it's a unique site because of its visibility and its frontage on one of our few commercial corridors on 38th Avenue. But it's also tucked in next to the neighborhood that's shown here in yellow. It's in irregular shape. It has some funky topographic challenges. It's just a tricky site. I've been working for the city for 10 years, and I would say in that time, we've probably met with 6 to 10 prospective developers about this specific property, and frankly turned away many of them who inquired about commercial uses or apartments. We had processed previously an application for townhomes. This is sort of the quintessential infill property surrounded by existing development with a wide range of uses. And at the end of the day, the reason that we recommended a plan development here is not only because it exceeds 1 acre, but because the plan development gives everybody more control and more clarity on what can happen and what it can look like. And in this case, sort of how it relates to the surrounding conditions. So with the plan development that you recommended or that you approved, we get the lower density single family homes next to the neighborhood and the duplexes next to the street. And we get that with certainty through this drawing that they had to provide. We also get architectural controls, which we don't actually have for our residential base zone districts. We also get a lower maximum height than other base zone districts. And this is essentially customized zoning for this property and this property's specific surroundings. From an applicant standpoint, there's actually some downsides to a plan development, and namely that they are timely, costly, and the process can be unpredictable. So applicants probably spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars preparing those drawings, the outline and specific development plans, and they aren't always approved. And plan developments also take much more staff resource, not only to review on the front end, but also to enforce over time on the back end. And that's essentially how we get to our third type of zoning, which is mixed use. The 2005 NRS Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy and the 2009 Comprehensive Plan both recognized that there was a lack of investment in the city's commercial corridors at the time that those documents were made. Developers were going to other cities, and small businesses were not reinvesting in their own properties, not just because our demographics and our market was different, but because our approval process through plan development was simply too timely, costly, and unpredictable. So those documents said we needed an alternative that would not only attract high quality development, but also ensure it. And so in 2010, we wrote the regulations for 4 new mixed use zone districts. We wrote them with our corridors in mind and for the areas close to the interstate and the train station. And for these districts, when it comes to that first question of what you can do, there's really a lot of flexibility in terms of use. So we allow commercial or residential, or a mix of the two in these districts. But for that second question, what can it look like? The code is very, very prescriptive in terms of the building and site design. So it's very predictable what a site will look like for us if it's developed under one of these mixed use districts. And our council at the time approved the rezoning of Wadsworth and 38th Avenue. We talk in the memo about city initiated rezonings. That was approved essentially to facilitate investment under the MUC and MUN zone districts to implement the vision documents for those two areas. So going back to that first slide, we couldn't achieve the vision for those corridors without the right zoning rules in place to achieve the built environment that our documents were calling for. I actually thought of another mixed use example after I wrote the memo. This is Fruitdale School property on 44th Avenue. And it was rezoned to mixed use neighborhood in 2016. This is what the zoning map looked like before that zone change request. And at the time, some of you may recall that the housing authority owned the property and they did not know what they were going to do with it. They were exploring commercial options and residential options, and we're really trying to figure out what to do with it. And this image shows that the property outlined in red was zoned agriculturally, residentially, and commercially. This kind of split zoning actually occurs on a surprising number of properties throughout the city, and it can obviously be a real impediment to reinvestment. So because the mixed use district allows residential or commercial uses, or a mix of the two, it allowed the housing authority to explore a wide range of options. And on a corridor like 44th Avenue, it's okay and probably important to have that kind of flexibility. That's actually the end of my slides for now, but I want to do a quick PSA. The zoning code right now is hundreds of pages. It's our largest chapter in the city code, and we don't expect you or anybody to know it sort of inside and out. That's certainly our job. Every day we get questions from homeowners and developers and attorneys and business owners on what they can do with their property and what it can look like. And sometimes people like the answers and sometimes they don't. But we have 6 planners on our staff who know those answers, and several rotate through as the planner of the day. Our walk-ins obviously don't look like they used to, but every day we do have somebody assigned just to answer sort of the random zoning questions that we get. I would say we probably get on average maybe 3 to 6 per day. Every day of the week. And so on this slide is our zoning hotline, phone number, and email if you or any of your constituents have questions. And with that, Ken and I can be your planners of the day.
The past several weeks have been tough on Colorado residents.
Okay, let me get off of, there we go. Thank you very much, Lauren. We will open it up for questions from council. Who has a question? Raise your hand. I know it was a good presentation, but I didn't answer all of your questions. Okay, Ms. Hoppy, thank you for starting us off.
Thank you, and thank you for the very detailed memo. And you answered it in your presentation, but I didn't quite catch it. So one of the questions I had was, why can commercial development properties not be zoned to NC, RC, C1, or C2?
So the code prohibits it. I went down a little bit of a rabbit trail trying to trace the code amendment series that maybe created that. But I think a lot of it is because, particularly with commercial uses, historically our community has wanted to know not just what do you think you're going to do if it's going to be a commercial entitlement, but what exactly are you going to do? And so that was the requirement, that if you wanted to get a commercial entitlement, you had to do a planned development.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Additional questions? Ms. Holteen?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm curious with the planned use, as a planned use proposal goes through the Planning Commission and staff, and they're evaluating how that actually fits in with the context of the neighborhood. So, you know, if it's as our most recent example on 38th Avenue, you know, it's got some R1 and some R2. What are the criteria that are used when evaluating a specific planned use proposal in the context of the surrounding zoning, and how is that looked at, and what kind of things do they consider?
Yeah, so each plan development is a little bit different, and I would say it's a very iterative process. So, on that property specifically, we had the benefit of some history of knowing sort of what the neighborhood feedback had been. And the first step after talking to staff is that there has to be a neighborhood meeting. So, we don't pretend to be the experts in any specific area in the city, but we use, and especially with the plan development, we use neighborhood feedback obtained in the neighborhood meeting to help inform sort of how we can evolve a plan development proposal to fit the conditions. So there are specific zone change criteria in the code. They relate largely to our guiding documents, which also are not super specific for individual properties. But using the 30th Avenue example, we heard that folks wanted a buffer to the south. So our base zone districts don't say you have to have a landscape buffer to the south, but we can require that as a part of that review. So it's very iterative. I would say with the plan development, we're probably going through 4 to 5 rounds of comments back and forth between staff and an applicant. Trying to convince them that it's in their best interest to take some of our guidance and to heed the neighborhood input, because it is, that's essentially the negotiated process. So there are specific criteria that we have to follow when we're recommending the zone change, but in terms of how does the site plan evolve, a lot of that is using the various input that we can get through the process. Does that answer your question?
It does. I do have a follow-up. So what we've heard a lot from people is the sort of the disconnect between maybe the existing character and quality of a neighborhood that's been identified as an area of change through the comprehensive plan. So it sounds like a lot of the planning process is actually looking at our visioning about where the city is going. And I know that, that can be hard to communicate like in detail to residents. So I don't even know what the question is, but like, how can we better engage people around like how we're preserving character in some places and how our visioning document is, inviting and compelling us to do, different types of development in other areas? I don't know if that's really a good question, but.
Yeah, our comp plans and vision documents aren't meant to be property parcel by parcel documents. So they're always going to leave a little bit gray that will be open to interpretation. And I think the reality for our community is that a property like the 9800 one is it's the one that's making a transition, right? Between a street or a commercial corridor and a neighborhood. And we have a lot of area. The Upham one was the same way, right? It was essentially a transition between a neighborhood and a commercial corridor. And those are always going to be the hardest ones, because the commercial side is going to see it one way and the residential side is going to see it another. And that's precisely why I think the plan development is the best tool, because you can, some sites may design differently based on sort of those different influences. I'd like to say that it means you need to participate in those neighborhood meetings on the front end, because that feedback really does get used and it gets leveraged. And every plan development applicant that we've worked with has heard from our staff, if you're not incorporating the feedback from the neighborhood meeting, then we're not scheduling a public hearing, because that's just not going to be fun for anybody. So, we can't design by consensus, because I don't know that especially with those transition properties, it'd be very hard to find a solution that everybody loves. And there's certainly, inherently documents that say preserve the character, but diversify the housing stock. And for some people that's mutually, that can't happen at the same time. And for some it can. But I think to just make sure that it's an open dialogue and to understand that these projects do evolve through the design phase over the course of a year. So they're not set in stone, and they are negotiated, especially the plan developments.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was really helpful. And it was a great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Mr. Seitz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Your presentation was excellent, by the way. But I do, can you go through, and you kind of touched on a little bit, the process from somebody walking through the door who may own a property like the 9800 property that's an R1, and they want to rezone it. Can you go through like maybe the physical process of those steps before it actually even comes before council?
Yeah, let me actually pull up the flow chart that we share in our pre-app and neighborhood meetings. Let's see, because I think that will help to have a visual aid. Okay. All right, do you see this black and white flow chart? So this is the process for a rezone. And the very first step, the very first step is a phone call of just like, I'm interested in doing this. It might come from a prospective buyer. It might come from a real estate broker. And I would say, I don't know, Ken, what do you think? We say no to 50% of anybody that wants to rezone their property. Zoning lasts for a really long time. And if you compare the 1972 map to our contemporary map, there's a lot of zoning that hasn't changed. So we take our zone change request very seriously. We often will sort of run it up the flagpole. We have our division meeting on Tuesdays and our development review on Wednesdays. And so we're saying no, I would say, to at least half of people that inquire before they ever get to step one here. And then if it's something that we think is sort of worth everybody's time to think further about, that first step, I know the font is pretty small here, but it's a pre-application meeting. It's an informal meeting that we hold every Thursday between our development review stop and the applicants, just to understand better what they're thinking about, what they want to do, why they want to do it, and to make sure that they understand the process, right? Some people want to just do a quick zone change, and if they hear it's going to take more than 6 months, they're going to walk away, and that's fine in some cases. We get pre-application submittal information 2 weeks in advance, so we can talk about it internally for 2 weeks. So we're really fully vetting what somebody wants to do at that first step. If we have that meeting and we think it's worth everybody's time, then we'll go to the neighborhood meeting. That's required for all zone change requests, and we'll talk about that mailing with our next agenda item, but essentially any owner and resident within 600 feet of the subject property. And it's really the applicant's meeting. We facilitate it to make sure that it feels like it's a productive civil conversation, but that's their opportunity to explain to their neighbors what they want to do and why, and get feedback. Sometimes people have visuals to share, and sometimes they don't yet. After the neighborhood meeting, folks would then prepare a complete application, and described further in the memo and sort of alluded to in my presentation, what a complete application looks like depends on what type of zone district you are requesting to be changed to. So once we get that, you all know we're not a full service city, and you hear us in our presentations at council. We send it on referral, and it goes to any utility provider, all the different divisions and departments in the cities. For a base zone district or a mixed use district, that application may just be a simple letter. So this referral process can happen pretty quickly. We get comments, we let the applicant know those comments, and then they may go straight to hearing. But for plan development, the step 4, 5, 6 rinse repeat cycle usually lasts, I would say, 6+ months, 6 to 12 months, depending. And then it's ready for a hearing. We don't schedule anything for a public hearing until we feel like an applicant has addressed all of our comments and concerns. And the first hearing is at Planning Commission. They make a recommendation to City Council. All zone changes are approved by ordinance per charter. So there's a first reading, that's the step 11 black diamond, and then the public hearing. And those sort of intermediate steps are indicating what that legal notice process is. So it's not a short process. For mixed use or base, it would usually take at least 6 months to get through this. And for plan development, it's usually 12 to 18 months, depending.
Thank you. I have Ms. Hoppy next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Lauren, in your memo, you had put zone change decisions are not arbitrary. For both legislative and private zone changes, the Planning Commission and City Council are compelled by code to base their decision upon all evidence presented with due consideration of the criteria for review. Can you speak a little bit about the criteria? I know we've seen them in our packets, but just for our audience, can you speak a little bit about the criteria in general, what they cover, and how many of those there are, and kind of what is the make or break line of how many they meet or don't meet?
Sure. So For a base or mixed use zone change, there's essentially 3 criteria. I'll share my screen again. These are all the kinds of questions that we answered at a pre-op, so I was expecting these. We have handouts pre-made with different criteria. So these would be the criteria for a base or a mixed use zoning. And the first one for any type of zone change is that it promotes the health, safety, and general welfare of the community, does not result in an adverse effect. That's a very sort of antiquated term, still important, but meant something different in the 1920s than it does today. It's still sort of the basis of zoning. We know that this is means different things to different people. The second criteria is that there's adequate infrastructure. And then our third one is really where we're trying to understand, how does this fit into the community's vision? So does our comp plans specifically support this zone change request? Or for the balance of these, is there something that's either wrong with our maps or something that's changed? Our comp plan right now is 10 years old. So it's possible, 10 years ago, the Gold Line station wasn't open. It's possible that the comp plan just doesn't sort of project forward enough. And this third criteria is really trying to understand, how does this relate to our vision as it was published at the time of the plan or as it exists today? There's nothing in the code that says you have to meet 2 out of 3 or you have to meet all of them. That language in the staff report, I might have even quoted, it's really about how do you make findings that address these criteria. The only difference between these and a plan development is the addition of this second criteria that is essentially saying, why are you choosing a plan development? So the point of a plan development is to be intentional, and we recommend it to applicants for specific reasons, not because we're trying to sort of shoehorn in something that shouldn't be there. And so that's just the one additional plan development criteria. Why did we choose with intentionality that specific district?
Thank you. Additional questions? Ms. Nosler-Beck.
Thanks, Mayor. And Lauren, the presentation is great. I feel like I'm going to use it as my cheat sheet and share it with everybody I know. So thanks so much. I'm just wondering, I get confused when I'm looking at the zoning stuff and it's like R2, I understand all of that, but then when it has like an A or a B after it, I don't know what that differentiation is all the time. And that's come up already, I think twice for us. And I just would like some more clarification.
Sure.
And if you can explain it in as easy of and understandable a way as you did with the presentation before, that'd be great.
Yeah, I will try to do that. So you should be able to see the list of the R series on your screen. And I'll just, annotating on Zoom is not great, but so the R1 series essentially means you can have a single family home, and the letter designation is just signaling to us how big is the lot. So R1 can be 1/4 of an acre. R1C, I think, is 5,000 square feet. So these are just, is it a huge single family lot or is it increasingly smaller? And each of these districts has a different minimum size and width. And it's the same sort of premise essentially for the R2 and 3. So in R2, you can have a single family or a duplex, and the size of the lot is going to be a little bit different. And then the same for R3. You can have single, duplex, or multifamily, depending on the size and the width. And those size and widths are just a little bit different in the R3 plane and the R3A. We have a web page on our city's website called Find Your Zoning, and there's a little table sort of summary for each different base zone district that shows those different sizes, widths, and setbacks essentially.
Right. Super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, additional questions? Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Going back to the item you brought up regarding the number of applicants that are not considered or that don't make it to that pre-app meeting, in thinking about that, in some ways, I think that would help our residents understand the amount of buffeting that is occurring at that stage, that the city staff is protecting the neighborhoods to a certain degree from unrestricted growth, and being able to quantify that in a way that gives the residents a better understanding of how much our staff is doing to protect the character of the neighborhood, given the number of applicants or number of units or the density that's being requested, and there's just being flat told no. And at this point, we're not really seeing any of that from a council perspective, because we're only looking at those applicants that have made it, to a decision point. Whereas if we could see that X number of square foot were considered for rezoning and didn't even make it off the table, that would, I think, help us communicate that the cases that are being brought forward to council are but a very small percentage of the overall, sort of pressure that's being put on the city to grow.
Right.
So in a sense, we already have, a growth restriction going on just because of the way that the zoning staff is sort of working through what's not even going to be plausible, but we're not really even seeing that. So if there could be a way to, like you mentioned with the Johnson Street property, we had 6 or 8, but only 2 of those came before council, and having a better understanding. And that may not be appropriate within a given case, but maybe on an annual or quarterly report or some sort of, status report, giving us an indication of, how many times we said no and what that looks like.
Yeah.
Sort of a no report.
Yeah. It's not often you have to track your unhappy customers, but we can certainly do that. It's actually a series of interview questions when we hire a new staff member in our division is not only how would you deliver the bad news, but sort of scenarios, understanding like, does somebody really have the gall to sit and deliver bad news? Because a lot of people aren't happy when you tell them, you can't do that. But we do that on a near daily basis.
And
Yeah,
I think
it's a good idea. We can think about how we can try to paint that picture.
Thank you. Ms. Weaver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Lauren, thanks so much. And just to follow up on Mr. Urban's question, could you also talk a little bit about Planning Commission's role? Because I think that having been on it for many years and seeing the depth of what Planning Commission sees compared to what then happens to council and kind of their role, just if you could just highlight that for our constituents a bit as well.
Sure, yeah. So our Planning Commission is made up of 8 representatives, 2 from each district, and they're appointed. And the way that we describe it to the commission is that the pro and con of their role is that it's not political, right? They're not elected, and they have the luxury of not being in your hot seats where they can really explain to their audience, we are compelled to just look at the code. And that's why we got appointed, to just look at the code and our comp plan. I actually got the question from a planning commissioner at one time of like, why are we always recommending approval? And it's in part because of what we talked about earlier, that we don't like to waste anybody's time on things that we don't want to recommend approval on. But Planning Commission reviews nearly everything that City Council reviews, and they also have an additional subset. So for example, for plan development, where Planning Commission and Council would see the zoning component of it, the outline development plan, the transparency part of a plan development is that the Planning Commission then has to review the very specific site details. So they get into a lot more of the detail in the weeds, I would say, if we're trying to compare your 2 roles. And Planning Commissions have been around essentially since the dawn of zoning for specifically that reason, to try to remove the political component of land use decisions, which, as you know, can be challenging.
Thank you. Ms. Hoppy, and then Ms. Stozman.
Lauren, can you just go over briefly kind of the differences in the processes when something is base zoned and the property owner has a use by right? So if it's an R2 and they have this space, then they have a right to use that space according to our code. So how does that process happen when someone says, I'm going to come in and build a duplex on this R2?
Right. So if you had zoning that allowed for a duplex, the next thing that we have to look at is whether the lot is big enough and wide enough. So just having use by right doesn't mean you can automatically go ahead and build. All of the other zoning regulations apply. So the size of the lot, can you park it? Can you accommodate enough landscaping? I mean, it comes into play when we get those sort of duplex townhome questions. And we've done an analysis recently of what is the potential? How many R2 lots do we have that have a single family home but would be eligible to have a duplex based on their size and their width? That kind of question actually comes into play even more with a commercial development, where I think we get some of our communities uncomfortable with the idea of the variety of uses allowed in mixed use, but we know that a property the size of a postage stamp, just because a grocery store is permitted, it doesn't mean it's actually can happen, because you can't accommodate the other rules that are applying in terms of parking and landscaping and drainage. So is the use permitted is the first question and the first hurdle, but there are still several other hurdles beyond that that would allow something to actually get developed.
Ms. Bozeman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I was actually very interested to see that planned development has been in use since the city's incorporation. You would think that with as much flack as it's been getting lately that it was a new concept, but so I was really interested to see that. And I wanted to thank you for the very thorough memo and for getting it out to us so that we could review it and for your presentation. I think this is extremely helpful, and I think it's also really extremely helpful for the public to understand that the planned development actually allows for stricter regulations than any base zoning. And so we've kind of had many conversations surrounding that topic, and we've really tried to stress that mixed use neighborhood and planned residential developments allow for the city to have a lot more strict and impose a lot more strict regulations than any of the other base zones. So can you maybe touch on that? And I know you touched on like the back and forth of public input versus, the outcome, but can you maybe go through a day in the life of a planned residential development and just say, like what that true vetting process is and the strict regulations that you often see, I guess?
Sure. Yeah, so I think part of the reason that a planned residential development has been getting a lot of flack lately is because you can have more density in a planned development than you can achieve in some of our multifamily districts. So that allowance is potentially greater. That said, when somebody comes in and wants to do a planned development, and let's say they want to do more density, our answer and sort of constant comment is that these are a give take. So if you're going to say, I want to have a few more units, then what is the community getting from that? Is it super high quality design? Is it, is it better landscaping? Is it a bigger buffer on a certain side? So with the planned development, in my mind, the message to a developer is always that it's a give and a take. So, we've seen some planned developments where they're asking for a little bit more in terms of the unit count, but they're also providing more parking than our base zoning would usually provide, or higher landscape coverage, or more detail in terms of the architecture. So my impression is that the perception is that getting more units potentially through a planned development is circumventing the zoning. And that's, I think, unfortunately, just sort of an oversimplification of what that process looks like, because what we're also getting is better site design, better control, better buffering, and often more of something, whether that's parking or landscaping. So in terms of the life of that PRD, that's often what those comment letters are, is the back and forth of like, so justify for me what your parking count is, or help me understand why we can't have more landscaping here if you're going to be asking for, X, Y, and Z. Does that help?
Lauren, could you pull up the Ames example? I think that's a good example of, where there was that give take that actually resulted in a land use pattern that was much more consistent with the existing neighborhood, but required a rezone to PRD that I think had a big upside for the neighborhood.
Yeah, so this is micro size. I can try to find the pages, but this is at the corner of 33rd and Ames, so the north east corner. And this came through probably last year. I can't remember now if it was this council or before last November, but it was essentially a down zone because the site wasn't quite big enough to accommodate 2 duplexes. So they were asking to build 2 duplexes on a slightly smaller land area. But the alternative of what could have been built here was 5 townhomes. And so they said, if we could have two duplexes on a slightly smaller land area, we're going to limit the height. We're going to make sure that they're architecturally compatible. We're going to have more landscaping, sort of the buffer to the multifamily and around the corner. So it was a downzoning in that under the previous zone district could have had more units and could have been taller, but they perceived it as a sort of win for them, obviously, because they got the unit type that they thought the market would benefit from, and we got sort of, in my opinion, sort of a better site and building design than we otherwise would have had under the base zone district. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had a quick question, and this is kind of a big what if, because I've heard it from a few residents. What if one of these PRDs, Fireside, whatever it is, goes in, and in 20 years, nobody wants to buy those houses, it needs to be redeveloped, and it's zone PRD now, what then does it become?
Sure. So our plan developments don't have a shelf life. We actually saw some plan developments get approved before the recession, and then the developers never moved forward. They still are recorded with the county. They're still running with the land like any zoning. But what has to happen is they essentially go through a new zone change process. So anytime we have a plan development that has to change those zoning standards, so number of units or height or setback, or just sort of the general design, we consider it to be a change in the zoning standards and goes all the way through the process. So it can happen over a long span of time, like in your example, like maybe 20 years later, it just needs to be different. And I think the bigger fear that I've heard is the bait and switch. You told me you're going to do 10 units, but what if you come in for building permits for 12? And that's just, it can't happen. These are set in stone in the same way that our zoning code is set in stone, and any change to those development standards on the outline development plan have to be processed as though it was a brand new zone change.
That was kind of my next follow-up question to that. With Johnson, there were two plans that needed to be submitted, I believe. One was submitted and the other one wasn't. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yep, that's a good question. So plan development is a two-step process. There's the outline plan, which is giving us the what are you going to do and what could it look like in terms of the standards. So max height, setbacks, architectural design. Plan developments cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So with, you've got to get a drainage engineer, landscape engineer, and architect. And the way that we can offer it is you can get your zoning. So for example, on Johnson, the document that you saw, you can get your entitlement to have these permitted uses with this general site design and these minimum and maximum standards. And then you can come back and do the second document where you're paying your architect and your drainage engineer, and you're getting the very specific drawings, and your only next step, if that gets approved, is to go to building permit. It's a choice for the applicant between time, money, and risk, right? So some developers will say, it's worth it to me to show everything I want to do at the very front end. I'm going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars and put it all through together. Upham did that. So you saw the outline and specific plan at the same time. And other people, understandably, want to sort of test the water and give enough detail so that we all understand generally what it's going to look like, but we'll then follow up with those specific drawings, which also have to go to a public hearing at Planning Commission. So our code allows those to be concurrent or subsequent submittals, but it's always a two-part document.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you, Mayor. I just have a question. Thank you for your presentation. And I enjoyed reading this, actually. I highlighted some things in there. But I have a question regarding commercial properties that are right in residential areas. We have a lot of, especially District 1, older. There's been buildings that have been a grocery store, or there's been other kinds of shops that are around. They are considered commercial. And when I was looking at the slide that you showed, can commercial then change their zoning to residential?
You know,
if they were commercial even before incorporation.
Yeah, so the pattern that you've described, a lot of it is because a lot of the city developed before our codes existed. So we do have pockets of commercial that feel like they're in residential neighborhoods. things that are old are sort of new again. So we call that the third place. And you get a contingent of people that sort of want the corner coffee shop or the corner dry cleaner. And of course, in our sort of more contemporary travel modes where you used to walk to maybe Wheat Ridge Poultry, now more people are driving. And so it creates additional impacts to think about when you have commercial uses embedded in neighborhoods. We rarely, I would say rarely see a commercial property request to be rezoned to a residential. We more often see that they want to be more of a mixed use property if they have underutilized land and they could add a residential component, but it's certainly something that could be considered. We have a lot of mismatch where we have commercial uses, some of them zoned residentially, and residential uses in commercial zone districts. So each of those gets fixed sort of on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, that pattern is definitely more present, I would say, on the east side of town than elsewhere.
Yeah, and so would there need to be like a minimum amount of land to be able to change the zoning?
It's a good question. So we actually don't have a minimum lot size for a commercial zone district because understandably it could be very different. So a sort of tiny coffee shop has a very different minimum than a grocery store. So what we're looking at in that case is just how does the site function? So there's not a minimum amount of land required for a commercial zone change.
Okay, but they can change if they
Yes.
got it approved.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a couple of questions. The first is, are there any zone change processes that require, or I guess at what point is a traffic study or traffic impact study required?
Yeah. So it's usually required at the point in time where we know what the land use is that we're analyzing. So for a base district or a mixed use district, we're not always requiring a traffic study at that time because we may not know exactly what the use is. So you can imagine an office would have a different traffic generation than a residential use, and both of those are allowed in mixed use. Sometimes if we have a specific concern or we think the applicant might want to know if they're going to need to do a traffic improvement, we can say, give us the worst case scenario, right, on this piece of property. But usually for a base or mixed use, it's later in the process when we know exactly what the use will be. For a planned development, we occasionally request it. We've got a couple in process where we've requested a traffic analysis with that ODP just to confirm that this land is developable in this potential way. But more often it comes in with the specific development plan where, again, we have a specific understanding of the unit count or the square footage.
Great, thank you. My next question is, can you talk a little bit about subdivisions, major and minor subdivisions, and sort of how those play out under, approvals and reviews?
Yeah. So when we talk about zoning, we're asking if the use is allowed, sort of what you can do with the land. And once we can pass that hurdle, the next question, what we can do with the land and what can it look like? And the next question is, we can do a subdivision 101 if you really want to. The next question is the land developable? So in that scenario, we're not talking about what's permitted, but quite literally, does it have street access? Does it have utilities? Is the topography working properly? How does it need to be graded? Is the detention size sufficiently? So it's really the nitty gritty of how do we take this land and do something with it? It's not what can we do with it, but how do we do it? And in a lot of communities, subdivision actually isn't even a process that goes through the public hearing because there are not discretionary review criteria. We're either getting it right because it's technically feasible or not. But one of the relationship between subdivision and zoning is where we do have minimum lot width, for example, lot size. So when you see a very straightforward sort of single family residential subdivision, we're just looking to make sure, did it meet the minimum size and width standards? But the purpose of subdivision separately from zoning is really like, how can we develop this land? And have we set it up with the easements and the rights of way and the lot lines to be able to do so? It's not quite as thrilling to talk about as zoning, but our engineers love to talk about it.
That's pretty high drama. I have one more question. So in your memo, you talk about overlay districts and that's something we've heard about from constituents the last couple of years. Can you talk a little bit about how an overlay district process would either be initiated, what would initiate it, and how would it kind of be handled by staff and then by council?
Yeah, so I glossed over overlays in my presentation because it's a little bit different, and it's it's not graphically represented, for example, on our zoning map. But overlays are where you have sort of the rule book that comes with the whatever color zone district you are, and then we add or overlay a whole nother set of rules. So the couple of examples of our existing overlays that we gave are floodplain. So when you flip on the layer of the floodplains, you see, here's what I can do with my property. But when I layer on the 100-year floodplain, my setback is actually different because it's affected by the overlay of that flood zone. We have the architectural and site design manual. And a lot of site approvals are not coming to council, so you may not be quite as familiar with this, but there's a setback that's maybe in the zoning, but on 38th Avenue, for example, or 44th is better. 44th Avenue, we want to have buildings closer to the street. So we have this additional manual that says, here's follow your rule book for your zoning, but then you're also going to need to be subject to these design requirements. Overlays are less like zone change requests and more like just code amendments, where we say we want this area of town to have a bulk plane, or we want this area of town to save all of our historic signs. So it's when we have a vision. So we said, what do we want this area to look like? And it's a different tool to get there, where we may not need to rezone everybody to have the same uses, but we want this one rule to apply universally. So you sort of identify a geographic area where you want new rules to apply, and then you do a code amendment, and that's how essentially how that would work out. So it's not like an individual person who would request it. It would be a policy goal that you had. Is there a specific type of overlay that you had a question about?
No, I know it's something that has been brought up in the last couple of years, and is something that I know when we were working on the NRS had been kind of discussed when we're looking at sort of the neighborhood district level. Could be items that are identified, by neighborhoods of things they want to preserve. So,
yeah, it's a good tool when you want something to apply. I'll bring up the bulk plane example because I think bulk plane could have been written as an overlay zone, and I think instead got written as these two zone districts is where it applies. It could have been, in residential zone districts in this area, bulk plane would apply, and that would have been how you'd write it as an overlay, instead of saying that it rides along with just a couple of the specific zone districts that we have.
Well, I think this is just two things. It's been incredibly helpful when I was preparing for tonight, and I've looked at the zoning map a lot. I've walked neighborhoods a lot. I mean, we have such a lack of consistency. When we were doing the NRS, the consultants the first night were like, we just lacked coherence when it comes to what do you do with it? And of course, we're like, we love the quirky, but at the end of the day, you have to translate that into something that makes sense. So I really appreciate, sorry, my dogs have something to say about this. So I appreciate the work you guys do to translate sort of a lack of coherence into something that is really helping bring quality. And I feel like I just got a graduate degree or a graduate credit. So I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Additional questions from Ms. Mikulak. Great presentation tonight.
Thanks.
Mr. Kirkpatrick and then Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Two questions, Lauren. The first one is just trivial. Why is Paramount Park zoned R1?
I mean, I can look at the original map. A lot. We usually with that kind of question, we'll say like, well, it's probably from Jeffco. But if you're trying to reconcile our zone districts versus what's on the ground, you can't always do that. So if you look back through the files, we got our original zoning map, and then we actually did a bunch of city initiated zone changes in the 70s to try to get our zoning to match our built environment, and it doesn't quite get there. But we have other code provisions that say when your zoning doesn't match your use, it's okay, and you can sort of live by this other rule book. So it'd be a exercise. If we maybe ever hit like a major recession, we could try to clean it up, but it'd be an exercise in futility maybe.
Okay. My second question, take us back to the first steps in the process for the property at 9800 West 38th.
Mm-hmm.
I've just acquired this property, or I'm going to acquire this property. It's zoned R1, I believe now.
Mm-hmm.
What options would I, as a developer, have if I purchase that property? Is there any option other than a PRD?
No, not in that case, because it was over 1 acre in size.
So
Yeah,
really, which begs the question, I'll put this to the mayor, to Ken, to you, to anyone who wants to answer it. I've only been in municipal government now 9 months, but I'm wondering what the history of zoning and zoning changes and so forth in Wheat Ridge translates into in terms of our reputation as a city that invites business and residential development.
Sure.
What I mean, compared to our neighbors, what advantages or disadvantages does our particular history have for us?
I mean, I think the inception of the mixed use district sort of answers that. We saw investment dollars going to other communities because the plan development process at the time was so onerous. So they looked at Lakewood and they looked at Arvada and said, is there anything less than 18 months? Because every day is $1. And it's not greedy, it's just a reality. And those dollars walked elsewhere. And that's why we created the mixed use district. So we, I think that's exactly sort of dealing with that reality and trying to balance a lot of interests on both sides. You know, I think the development community watches, right? So we've seen some interesting things occur in zoning and land use. And, you know, I'll use the Upham one as an example. When that question failed at the ballot for whatever reason, there were several contracts that were terminated because developers were like, well, I'm not even, you know, I might have the best project in the world, but I'm not willing to accept that risk. So there is, you know, there is an impact. We're lucky because, as we heard from our consultants in the NRS, location, location, location. We are an inner ring suburb, and there will always be interest because of where we're located next to Denver and the interstate. But the level of that interest will sort of depend on the tools that we have to get people there and sort of the reception by our community. Thank you.
Sure. By the way, that was an excellent presentation. Where do I register for zoning 102?
We can accommodate that.
There's a fee for that class. Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Last question, I promise. It's kind of a weird question, I guess, but so you showed us the flow chart, and what happens after step 9 or 13 or 12 or whatever it was, where it goes to city council and it fails? What happens then?
So we have a provision in the code that says any type of application, whether it's a zoning or otherwise, cannot, a similar application cannot be entertained for a period of a year. So there's essentially a cooling off period. And we've interpreted that pretty conservatively, maybe. So like the Johnson property had a fail on a residential project, and we didn't entertain any applications of any residential sort of density or scale for a period of a year. And, you know, that's, I think sometimes people cut their losses and move on, and sometimes people try again, but there is that mandated cooling off period.
So my follow-up to that would be, what if it passes city council and there's a referendum, like Upham? What happens with those properties? Same thing, or? Like
with Upham where it failed at the ballot?
Yeah. So does it reverts back to its original zoning, I assume?
Correct.
And then is there another year cooling off period? Is it?
We've not had to figure that out yet because we've had a couple pre-ups for that Upham property and nobody's been interested in moving forward. So I think we've now probably passed the 1 year. But that's the first time it's happened in my time here.
So if there's a referendum, though, it doesn't say that zoning is going to be that zoning forever. It just says until the next application comes in and.
Right. Yeah. Zoning doesn't expire. So it is what it is. It reverts back to what it was. And then it is that until somebody wants to try something else.
And if I can ask one more kind of, I don't know if you even want to answer this question, you can say no. Do you know, in your expert opinion, why 2E, why Upham failed on the ballot?
I mean, as you know, by the 14-page synopsis, zoning is complicated and it's hard, you know, and ballots are political. So it's really hard to sort of message and educate. Anytime, I mean, for the Upham one, frankly, anytime there's a ballot question, staff is really limited in what we can do and what we can describe and what we can say when something's on the ballot. Zoning is complicated, and feelings about development, as you all well know, are heated. And I think it becomes a sort of more of a PR thing than a zoning issue, for better or worse.
Really appreciate your presentation tonight, Lauren. It was really good. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Ms. Hoppy had her hand up.
I have an impression that now sounds like I was under the wrong impression, but I thought that if it fails at council, if you make a significant difference in the application, then you can reapply. And I thought it was something like a significant, as in like, you know, like a 30% change or something like that. And so can you correct me, please?
That is the word that's used, but there's no further explanation in the code what we mean by significant. So, you know, we try to picture, what if it was on the front page of the paper? Would we sort of get general consensus as a community that this is significantly different? And the only other time we've had to interpret that is, you know, was the 14 or 16 townhomes significantly different than the 10 residential units? And, you know, from a traffic standpoint, they're pretty similar. From a drainage standpoint, they're pretty similar. From a height standpoint, they're pretty similar. So we made that call that wasn't a significant difference. So each one is sort of case by case, and, you know, we err on the side of, can we feel like we defend that on the front page of the paper?
So would it still have to be, would it still have to be a year though? You would have to make a significant difference and still wait a year, or you can make a significant difference and then reapply, just turn around and reapply?
If we decide that it's significantly different, you can reapply without that wait period. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, additional good discussion, good questions, good answers. Any more questions and answers for Ms. Mikulak? It's still, she's still on the grill.
No, we call her Spod. Think of them later.
All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation. Looks like we've exhausted the council questions. So thank you very much for that presentation.
Yeah.
And we will continue to work on zoning issues, all of us. We'll go to item number 2, and this is a review of public notification procedures and policies for land use cases. And Mr. Stites and Ms. Hoppy brought this up. And I don't know if they want to start the discussion, or Mr. Goff, do we have a staff presentation on that item?
We do. I think Professor Mikulak is going to do this one too. If I don't want to give her a break so she can get a glass of water, but I think this item is fairly narrow in its approach, and based on what we heard from Mr. Stites and Ms. Hoppy. So it's not too complicated, but we could introduce it if you'd like. That if Mr. Stites doesn't have anything, or Ms.
Okay.
Hoppy.
Or Ms. Hoppy is here with her hand up, so I'll go to her.
In the spirit of giving Lauren a quick break, Councilmember Stites and I had significant conversations with several people in the community, and a lot of those conversations were around, well, I didn't know, or I was just outside of the notification, or it was unclear because there was only one sign and there were 3 lots, so that kind of stuff. And so we had put it on the future agenda items, and then he and I kind of narrowed it down to specifically kind of the 3 things that are addressed in this very well-written memo, and thank you again for that, Lauren. And I think that the memo addresses and the suggestions address at least what I was thinking when Mr. Stites and I were having these conversations. So I do greatly appreciate you putting the work into this.
Sure. Yeah, my presentation for this one is quite a bit shorter. Obviously, a discussion on public notice in general could be longer, and I think we mentioned in the memo we expect that to happen as we get feedback from our resident engagement program. But for tonight, let me share my screen again. Let's see. Okay. So for tonight, we'll just focus on a couple things. So I think you all know that there are several types of development applications that we process that result in a public hearing, either at council, at planning commission, or at the Board of Adjustment. And I think we can all agree that public notice is a really critical legal requirement. And essentially in our code, the extent of the notice corresponds with the level of review. And so public hearings being the most extensive, require these 4 types of notice: sign, letter, newspaper, and website. And the memo summarizes the real detail that's included in both the code and the charter in terms of what these 4 types of notice have to look like. But as you all have just talked about, we're going to really focus just on the size and location of signs and the mailing radius for letters. So with signs, this is an image of a recent 9800 again, the recent posting sign. And you know, it feels like it sort of goes without saying, but the purpose of the sign on the property is to capture the attention of people who are walking or driving by. It needs to be legible and it needs to communicate some key information. And as we were bringing this topic more to our consciousness as a staff, we realized that this sign design has been unchanged for at least 2 decades. And the code requires a lot of content to fit on that sign. So in our opinion, I think the issue is not so much with the size itself, but with the overall design. And we will definitely be redesigning these signs. We've budgeted accordingly for the signs to likely increase, but there's probably no need to change the minimum in the code, which is 22 by 28. Where it certainly does seem to warrant an update is the number of signs required. And what we did was a code analysis of not a code analysis, but a case analysis of recent projects and properties that have been subjects to public hearings. And we included some of those maps in the packet. But essentially, I think if we're trying to maximize the effectiveness of the signs, we'd recommend that there be more signs required for longer frontages. So you see the breakdown there, 1 per street frontage, and then 200 to 400 foot of frontage would have at least 2 signs, and then 1 sign per 400 foot of frontage, I think would result in a more appropriate and more effective sign noticing. I don't have the maps on these slides, but I can pull them up if we need to talk about those examples. For the letter notice, we reviewed our code, but we also looked at neighboring jurisdictions, a couple of whom are undergoing some updates to these noticing procedures. And we are definitely out of sync, I would say, with other communities. So these tables are showing the mailing distance for the neighborhood meeting on the left, which is required for a zone change or special use, and the public hearing on the right. And you can see Wheat Ridge in red. We're definitely on the lower end for the public hearing notice distance. But the bigger anomaly for us has sort of long been the fact that those 2 notifications don't match. You know, we host the neighborhood meetings, and it's always a little bit of an awkward moment to say half of you will get a mailing if this proceeds to public hearing. And that probably should have been our gut check a while ago to propose a code amendment, but it would be nice to be able to say, and you would all be receiving a mailing again. So we're definitely recommending that these 2 numbers match. We'll leave it up to you to decide sort of what number makes sense. These numbers were picked likely with intention. We're on the Denver Metro street grid, and 300 feet is about a 1 block radius, and 600 is about 2 blocks. And we included those visuals in the memo. I can pull those up if we need. But essentially, as I said, we recognize that there's probably other ways we could improve communication in terms of what development is happening or coming. And I expect that we have that conversation over the coming months. But for the purpose of tonight, we'd love your direction on redesigning the sign, amending the code to change the number of the signs, and then also seeking input if you agree that the mailing distance should match for both the neighborhood and public hearings. So that's all I have for that intro.
Okay, then we'll open for questions. Ms. Hoppy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Lauren, would you mind sharing attachment number 2 and attachment number 3? I think that they're good visuals that our citizens would appreciate seeing on the screen, and just touching on like one of the properties on attachment 2 and maybe one of the properties on attachment 3, please. So
I did load them to slides so that we could reference them. So let's see, I don't have my memo pulled up. This is one of the attachments where we essentially took some of our larger properties and measured the street frontages. The image on the right is Applewood Village Shopping Center. It's huge. It extends from 32nd to 38th Avenue. But from a public hearing standpoint, we would say this is 1, 2, 3 street frontages. So, finding a sign in that project would be challenging. But if we did amend the code to say that it was 1 per 400 linear feet of frontage, then you'd end up with 3 signs on 38th Avenue, 5 on Youngfield, and 2 on 32nd, which just feels more appropriate for a property that size. This is the vacant property at 44th and Kipling, so same thing. This is would be a public hearing if they would to move to subdivision, and same theory that large frontages probably warrant a few signs, even though on a vacant property, 1 may be easier to see. More would be better. And then we looked at smaller projects as well. So on Upham, this is where I think we had some frustration over, there were 4 homes on 3 parcels and only 1 sign. This frontage is 260. So we could at least bookend in the future on a property of this size, what the limits of that subject property is. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then the other exhibit that we included was just sort of a sample of what a mailing radius looks like. This is a property on 30th Avenue that was rezoned to mixed use. And you can see in each of these images, which are all scaled the exact same, that the 300-foot radius extends essentially 1 block. Depends on sort of the size of the subject property sometimes. But then in this side is the 600-foot radius and extends 2 blocks. So these are the guys that get the neighborhood meeting mailer. And then if it proceeds, it's quite a bit smaller to get the public hearing mailer.
Thank you for sharing those.
Sure. Additional questions? Ms. Hutchinson?
Got it. Thank you, Mayor. After reading through this, I do agree with having more signs so that it's more visible for when people are going by. And then also increasing the neighborhood meeting letter and the public hearing letter to 600 feet. 2 blocks is really nothing when we're doing development here. And we talk about people might not know what's going on. That kind of would cover it. And also, we're only one of 3 cities listed here that has a difference. Most of the rest are the same between their public meeting and, the neighborhood meeting and the public hearing. So I agree. I like the idea of the 600 feet for better communication. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Urban.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't know if there's a way for us to create a mechanism whereby someone at the community meeting can elect or request to be put on a mailing list for a public hearing, or for those that are driving by a particular property can sign up for to receive a notice of some kind relative to that particular hearing, or if residents could be put on a citywide mailing list for all public notices, regardless of their location, to sort of turn it around, as opposed to, having people having the requirement that they need to be adjacent to the property in order to know what's going on. Could there be anybody who wants to receive any kind of notice, they can be put on that list or do something like that?
Yeah, it's a good comment. I mean, there's certainly some challenges to managing a lot of those requests, but what we're working on and what I would personally like to see from our division is just not necessarily that they get added to the legal letter mailing, which is filling that legal requirement, but that we have other mechanisms. We've had some difficulty integrating our GIS mapping into our website, but there's a lot of communities that have very robust interactive maps where you can go and understand what's going on in my neighborhood or what's going on next door, see what some of those development plans look like. we have the notify me feature, so you can subscribe to the city's website to get notified every time there's a planning commission hearing, for example. So there are probably a few mechanisms where you can feel more informed, but I think we can do better, and that's certainly part of what Jeff is brainstorming. Jeff Hurt, who's managing that Let's Talk program, and definitely something that we want to specifically ask folks about. Our resident survey indicates that a really high number of people get their information just from word of mouth. And to the extent that we can make sure our solution is matching where they're seeking information, that's what we want to do. You know, none of this is secret, it's all public record, and I think everything would flow a little better if everyone had access to the information. So we probably wouldn't do that for the legal letter, but it's definitely our goal to make sure the information people want is available when they're trying to find it.
And I'm okay with it being bifurcated, separated from that legal notice and making that a separate deal, but making sure that people have that mechanism to say, I want to see everything that's going on, right, and have that sort of notification set up. And my understanding is we have a Google map that relates to our zoning process. And how is that updated, or how often is that updated, or what's the use of that?
It's fairly rudimentary at this point. So when we get a case, it gets added. And then when the case is closed, it gets eliminated. So when it gets added, it gets an information sheet that shows the vicinity map, sort of a brief description of what the proposal is and the staff contact. But we don't upload, for example, like all of the plans. That Google map cannot support that. So what I'd like to do, and there are some really good examples. I think Arvada just launched their newest mapping platform where you can click on a property and see sort of the most recent submittal. You know, that would have been a real challenge maybe 10 years ago when everything we got was paper, but all of our submittals are electronic now. So while it's still definitely falls on the planners to manage those maps while we're also managing the process, we don't have like an IT person who would do that. But it's certainly something that I think is easier now that all of our documents are electronic. So it's not very rudimentary, but got dreams for something better.
Is there any way to have that set up to notify people when the Google map is changed, or is there a notification set up for that?
I don't know, but I can certainly look into that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Additional questions? Mr. Stites.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As far as the signage goes, you guys just reuse the same signs, basically?
They're plastic. We can't reuse them, but we print like 100 at a time, and then we Sharpie on them, and then they get disposed. They're corrugated plastic, so. Just
like a regular yard sign. Is that why there's kind of the reluctance to change the signage on it, or the size of it, just because it's easier to get that size, or?
No, I would guess that the size will change, but I think it's not sort of an arbitrary, let's make it bigger. I think we need, there's actually some communities like Atlanta worked with like a graphic design firm to say, let's make these signs really effective. So I think the sign will be dictated by how can we make the content better. Most communities actually don't have a minimum size. It's really based on the function. So I would guess they get bigger. But I'm not sure what that would end up being until we have a better design, essentially.
Okay. Just since I agree with you, and I think with Councilwoman Hutchinson, that I think going to 600 feet on both the notification for the mailing is probably a good idea. And I'm not exactly what that redesign of the sign looks like, but I do think we need to do that. And then I do like the idea of the signage every 200 feet. I think that's a very good idea. So thank you.
Ms. Hulteen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have two questions. One is, how do we measure the 300 feet? It kind of looks like it's a center point, concentric line out, or do you measure the 300 feet from the property lines out?
It's measured radially from the property line.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then my second, it's more of a comment, but I guess I support all of the recommendations. I support going to 600 people notification for both processes. And I definitely support updating the sign. As far as the placement of signs on the frontage, I think it would probably be pretty rare, but in the event that you've got two properties that have less than 200 feet of frontage, I think it would be good to still require bookending signs on that so that we're identifying that in some respects. So I'd like to suggest we consider modifying, in the event that it's less than 200 feet, multiple properties or multiple improvements, something to delineate it so that it's not confusing to people. I think in the case of Upham, a sign on each one might have been confusing, but that one's over 200 feet. But the bookend signs, I think, would have been really helpful.
So just to make sure I captured that. So if the frontage is less than 200 feet and comprised of one parcel, then one sign is fine. But if it's less than 200 and comprised of multiple, then we bookend.
Yeah.
Additional questions? Ms. Hoppy?
I'm just going to try to move us to a consensus. So if there are other people who have questions before I go there, I don't mean to cut you off.
Okay, then we'll see if there's any other questions from council before we go to a consensus. Seeing none, why don't you try for a consensus?
Super. First, I would like to say that when we first took the NRS recommendations, all the council that were seated were saying, we want to make sure we can walk and chew gum at the same time. This is an exact example of walking and chewing gum at the same time. Yes, there probably will be more recommendations later down the road to tune this up, but for now, I think this works very well for our community. So I'd like to ask for consensus to consent to the staff recommendations with a 600 foot for both neighborhood meeting and planning meeting, and for properties that are less than 200 feet but are made of more than one parcel, still have 2 bookending signs. I think I covered it.
All right, consensus on that. Raise your hands, please. Looks like we have consensus on that.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. We'll get that captured in ordinance and get it through to Planning Commission and then to council.
Okay. Thank you. Does that capture all of the consensus or the direction that you were looking to receive on this item?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So that should conclude our item number 2. We will now go to staff reports. Mr. Goff.
Mr. Mayor, I thought this conversation was going to go much longer, so I didn't prepare anything additional this evening.
Well, don't start now.
So I'm good. Thank you.
You're good. Okay.
Yep.
Then I will throw it open to our electeds who are on the screen and invite Mr. Miller also, who's with us. Is there anyone who would like to have anything for our public out there? Ms. Hutchinson.
I'll get it. Oh, good.
There you are.
Okay, thank you. I just want to state that I have seen more people wearing masks lately, and I really do appreciate that. And also, I know a lot of people have air conditioning and swamp coolers and closed air systems in their houses. When it kind of gets cooler, like early morning, later at night, open your windows and let some fresh air come in. I'm kind of nervous about closed air systems and things like that. And I wonder about the schools also, where we build things now and windows don't open. Fresh air helps with virus and I just want to throw that out. Thank you for wearing masks. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hutchinson. Any other public officials reports? Mr. Kirkpatrick.
Just very quickly to let you know that we have approved the form of the petition to revoke the zoning change on Johnson at 38. I have no other details about how many signatures have been collected or anything. I bring it up only because we have seen a number of signs around the city inviting people to come to a driveway coffee or a garage sale / petition signing. So you may be able to participate in some of those conversations if you are tending to the signs you see. And if any developments occur other than that, I'll be sure and let you know immediately.
Thank you. Additional elected officials reports. Ms. Hulteen.
Thank you. I actually have a question for Patrick. I realized I was off the grid last week, but right before I left, there was notification that the county had been put on notice for a 2-week compliance with its COVID case rate. And I'm just wondering if there's any updates in terms of what that's looking like, and if there's anything that we should be thinking about or anticipating.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Ms. Hulteen. Good question. The good news is the cases have decreased somewhat in Jefferson County. I don't think they're below the threshold yet. I don't know the exact number, but there was Jefferson County had like a 92 case increase like overnight a week or so ago, which really took the county over the threshold of what was allowed. We had a conference call with Dr. Johnson last week, and he mentioned that they believe the case increases in Jefferson County are coming from either folks who live here traveling and then coming home and maybe bringing it back, or people traveling from outside into Jefferson County. And then also the large number of small gatherings that are starting to happen. People are having barbecues, baby showers, different things like that. So maybe not coming from large events, but people are getting more comfortable in having people over into their backyard or into their house, and they believe that's where some of the increases are coming from. They do believe, though, that if our variance expires, that it really won't impact the county all that much, because after the county got their variance back in June, the state made a bunch of changes to what was allowed and not allowed, and the state's changes are almost as liberal or more liberal than what the variances were for the county. One variance change that would be impacted on Jefferson County is group sizes, mainly. As an example, like in gyms, the variance that Jefferson County had was you could allow up to 50% capacity in a gym, but the state's only allows up to 25% capacity. So that would be one impact, but for the most part, the county would not lose. Don't necessarily want to promote that too much because we want people to wear masks still and try to get our numbers down. But what we've been told is the changes that the state has made statewide really override the Jefferson County's variance at this point.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Additional elected officials reports. Any other business that we need to come to tonight? Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Ms. Mikulak, thank you so much. You've done yeoman service tonight and giving us some great information. We really appreciate that. Tough topics. Always thank you to Ms. Scheck for handling our IT on the meeting, and all of the counselors and the public who have joined us on this meeting. We appreciate you being here and learning how your government works. So we will be back at regular session a week from tonight at our Monday meeting at 7 o'clock. So we hope that you will all have a good week, and if you're possible, to join us then. So thank you very much. Good night, everyone.